NEPM's podcasts are funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com. The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, helping customers make the switch to solar for savings, energy security, and tax incentives. Learn more at northeast-solar.com.
Welcome to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith.
And I'm Monty Belmonte. Apologies to my dad, but Mr. Universe is getting bumped until later in the week. But later in today's show, we'll learn about regenerative farming and how it might literally save the earth.
Like the soil where you put the seeds that grow. There's a documentary called Common Ground screening at Amherst Cinemas tonight, and we'll talk with regenerative farming expert Mary Johnson from Ashfield. But first, I went up to get more coffee, and I had mentioned that I was reading a really sad book to the cashier, and I got up and she's like, "How is your sad book going?" And I'm like, "It's the worst," but not because it's badly written. It's incredibly well written. And then she's like, "Wait, are you okay?" And I didn't realize I had started crying at the cash register at Essalon, just ordering coffee. And I'm like, "Oh crap, I'm crying." Like, I'm really sad right now.
I'm so sorry. David Daley is the author of the national bestseller. How are we going to do this one on public radio? I think when I had you on my old show, I allowed you to pick a sound effect to bleep out the name of your other book. Do you have a preferred sound effect that we can use to bleep it out with?
I like what we did last time. I think we just had a mouse kind of squealing.
Okay.
How about J.D. Vance squealing on a sofa?
I don't know if there's a sound effect for that yet, but I think we could make
No one
one.
can prove or deny that that's happened.
It's good. I love you guys.
The name of the national bestseller that David Daley wrote was called Rat Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which helped spark the drive to reform gerrymandering. That didn't go so well. He regularly discusses democracy and voting rights on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and other outlets.
I would argue that this book goes into why that didn't go so well.
Yes.
His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among others. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and he lives in Haydenville, Massachusetts.
His new book, out Tuesday, is Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections.
I have been describing this book as a horror, almost like true crime-ish.
If you are somebody who is not on the far right, this book might be disturbing to you. It's not quite a sequel to Rat, but I think a lot of what you talked about in that book about playing the long game on how to rig elections in one party or the other's favor. There's one party that's really, really good at this and another party that's not so good at it. This goes even further into that long game. This is essentially a book about Chief Justice Roberts. It's the story of Roberts' rise to the highest court in the land.
I think more the example that Chief Roberts' rise sets as precedent.
And his role in where the court is at now. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to tell this story kind of through the lens of Chief Justice Roberts?
Sure. This book really has a lot of similarities to Rat. If Rat was trying to tell the story of how our state legislatures and Congress became so warped, how one side controlled all of the power, even though they consistently won fewer votes, this is sort of the Rat of the Supreme Court. What I'm trying to do here is explain how over 50 years it came to be that the right essentially captured the U.S. Supreme Court and now controls a supermajority there and has been able to essentially upend precedent, rework the law, change the very essence of America itself on voting rights, on affirmative action, on guns, on religion, on the separation of powers, most recently on the question of whether or not a president is still subject to the rule of law like everybody else. And what has happened as the court has changed, the law has changed. And it has tipped the law in all of these cases in the direction of the Republican Party, of the interests of the conservative movement. And it has done so in a way that is fundamentally opposite to public opinion polls on just about all of those issues. So what the right and the conservatives figured out here was how to use the court in a way to get around the ballot box, to get around the American people, and to enact fundamentally unpopular policies that could never win elections through the force of judicial fiat.
I think it's interesting that the subtitle of your book is Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. I think most people, when they hear about Chief Justice Roberts, don't think of him as a far-right figure. They think of him, as he likes to say, as a justice who's just calling balls and strikes. There are certain rulings that have come out from Roberts in particular. I'm thinking about Obamacare off the top of my head, where Roberts could have ended Obamacare but didn't. So then people see Chief Justice Roberts in this way that says, oh, well, he's a fair-minded justice. That is not the way that he's presented in your book. Can you talk a little bit about his backstory and what leads you to come to these conclusions about Justice Roberts?
Absolutely. The myth that Chief Justice John Roberts is an umpire, a simple institutionalist, a caller of balls and strikes, is central to his image, but it could not be further from the reality of his decisions. If Roberts's fellow justices might be arsonists who want to simply light the house on fire, Roberts is much more of the patient incremental bulldozer who knocks the house down one piece of the floorboard at a time. He's the old Johnny Cash song, one piece at a time, right?
I'd get it one piece at a time, and it wouldn't cost me a dime.
He's getting the car home, just nobody notices what he's doing. He is the chef who has the frog in the pot of boiling water, and he's slowly turning it up rather than putting the frog on the menu and telling it that it's going to be served for dinner. So what Roberts has done in a series of cases, and the ones I talk about in this book are the ones that are focused on voting rights and democracy. So I use the Citizens United decision from 2010 that unleashed billions of dollars of dark money into our politics. I use the Shelby County decision from 2013, which effectively eviscerated the most crucial enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act that had held some of the worst behavior by southern state legislatures in check up until that point in time. And I use his decision in the 2019 Rucho versus Common Cause case, which essentially closed the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims.
Which is what I alluded to in the intro there.
Exactly.
This was something that you were raising the red flag about in your previous book, but has now come to fruition that the Supreme Court has ruled on this in partisan gerrymandering.
And what Roberts does in these cases is kind of fascinating. There is an earlier case to each one of these. Roberts does sort of a two-step. If this was a Rocky Horror Picture Show, it would be a step to the right and then a leap to the right.
It's just a jump to the left.
Filled with anticipation.
And so what he does is he drops the breadcrumbs of where he's going to go into the first case. In Shelby County, that first case is called Northwest Austin, and it went almost entirely unnoticed at the time. It was a small water board in Texas that wanted to get out from under a preclearance. And they said, well, we're just a little old water board. What do we have to apply to the Department of Justice if we want to move our elections from Bob's garage down to the schoolhouse? Except this case had been brought by some of the wealthiest, most connected conservative donors as a way to sort of drive the first nail into preclearance in the Voting Rights Act. And Roberts backs away from the big question there. He works out a compromise with the liberals on the court, and he finds a way to free this little Texas board from preclearance while dropping the breadcrumb that would become Shelby County. And he does so through a fundamentally dishonest reading of the actual precedent. He simply edits out the part he doesn't like with an ellipsis, remakes the entire law, and then quotes himself in the Shelby County case from the previous one and claims that there is this long-standing historical tradition. Well, it's one that he entirely had made up in the previous case that no one really noticed a few years earlier and slipped through. And so he undoes the Voting Rights Act, which is the most successful civil rights legislation that the country has ever seen. And he does so through this fundamentally dishonest tactic. And this is the true John Roberts. He moves silently, he moves swiftly, he doesn't leave a lot of fingerprints. But the damage that he's done, the upending of precedent, the different nation we live in 2024 compared to the one that we live in 2005 when he becomes Chief Justice is wild and dramatic.
Later in the show, for a Shred of Hope, we'll hear about the importance of regenerative agriculture and the documentary all about it that is screaming at Amherst Cinema tonight.
But up next, more with Haydenville author David Daley on just how successful the Supreme Court's changes in the Voting Rights Act were in keeping certain people in certain states from the polls.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
We're speaking with author David Daley. The new book, Antidemocratic, comes out Tuesday, August 6th, and it talks an awful lot about Chief Justice John Roberts, who has been playing this game with the Voting Rights Act since the Reagan administration.
And before, frankly, in your book, it goes into how the Voting Rights Act was one of the things that he's been after for literally, or looking at as an important rung in a ladder of things to come. And I think in the past 5-ish years, we've seen the other rungs on that ladder. To your point about the Voting Rights Act, you mentioned in your book that like immediately you see the fallout of this. Like you see the fallout of Black voters, Latino voters, of extremely poor voters, just because of this one decision. And I think a really interesting contrast that comes up in your book is how the states afterwards that try to follow in its example, which ones are more successful. I'm thinking specifically of North Carolina and how unsuccessful they were because they were not as good at subtlety. And I think that subtlety is something that is shown and ingrained through this particular pipeline that has been developed. So I think we have to bring up and explain for our audience about originalism.
And the way that you present originalism, which we hear a lot about now in response to the way the Supreme Court makes decisions, you present it in some ways as a Trojan horse, that this originalism idea is something that comes out of the Federalist Society and or the Heritage Foundation, which is another organization that, especially with Project 2025, people have been hearing a lot from.
I think that originalism is 100% a Trojan horse. I think that's the perfect way to describe it. But I would suggest that its actual historical roots go back even further. You begin to see conservatives talking about originalism and original intent immediately after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education and the end of segregation in public schools. That is when, in the mid-1950s, you begin to see Barry Goldwater and the National Review and conservative law professors talking about how, well, we have to get back to the original intent of what the founders were actually saying. And they talked about this in voting cases as well, right? The founders weren't thinking about literacy tests, so there's no constitutional ban on any of that. Well, I mean, let's be clear about who the founders were and what the conditions were in the country when these documents were written, that slavery still existed, that the white men who wrote this document owned slaves. And so looking back to the original intent when you are trying to fashion a multiracial democracy 200 years later fundamentally doesn't work. But originalism becomes the way that the right masks their own intent of winning political decisions through the law because it sounds neutral. Originalism sounds lovely.
It really
right?
does. I think people want to believe in that.
The thing is, I don't think it does at all. If we're actually talking originalism, we're starting to talk about the idea of putting into place a set of original laws that were, with the original intent, supposed to be flexible. And if flexibility is what we're looking at as original intent, this entire thing, again, as you say, is a Trojan horse. Like, this is a veneer.
I do think that people want to say, that's not constitutional. The Constitution doesn't say that. I want to believe in the Constitution. And a couple of things about this. One, I think people of a certain bent believe in originalism because they believe in the Bible. I mean, a lot of evangelicals are used to saying, here is a book that has very specific things written out. I may interpret them my own way. You may interpret them your other way. But people on my team, in my flavor of evangelicalism, interpret it this way, and that's the word, and that's that. Originalism is doing this same thing. It's reading the Constitution in a way. They may say, well-trained militia is in the Constitution, but we're going to ignore that. In the same way they may say, you can't grow this type of grain in your field in Leviticus, but we're going to persecute gays because of the same chapter. There's a parallel here between originalism and, I think, evangelicalism. But what I love about your book, you quote a Michael Grieve who says, originalism is conservative agenda in drag. And that no one, when they were trying to do this 50 years ago, thought that this would take hold as a way to rule in cases in the Supreme Court.
They didn't even know they'd be this opposed to drag.
I'm not much of a man by the light of day.
You're right. They didn't think that they'd be able to get away with this because they thought in reality that it was ludicrous. In the book, I track down and I find all of these memos written by Federalist Society acolytes who were working in the Reagan White House in the 1980s as they're talking about this. And they're really clear about it. They're like, we can't get these anti-abortion people on the court if they come in to the congressional hearings and say what they're actually going to do. So what we need to do is find language that these people can use in order to get on the bench without actually saying how they're going to rule in these cases. And being able to simply say, oh, I am an originalist and I believe in the original intent becomes the code word to the right that these justices are on the team, will play ball, and can be trusted to rule in ways that the folks who put them there wanted them to, without having to be afraid that the other side would easily be able to knock holes in their cases.
Does anyone else see the irony of putting female originalists on a court?
Because if you remember, listener, the Constitution does not allow women to vote in its original intent or to be Supreme Court justices, I'm sure, for that matter. I haven't looked so deeply into it. But yes, and these people in your book are groomed by the Federalist Society, to the point where when President Trump is picking his Supreme Court justices, there's a literal list that is given to him from the Federalist Society.
The Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation make the list of approved judges that Trump can choose from. And this was how Trump signaled to the right that he was a conservative. And it was the deal that conservatives made to elect Trump. Yeah, but Gorsuch was really the phrase that they would use. We got the judges we wanted, and the judges will outlive Trump. The judges are the legacy of the conservative legal movement because that was the purpose of the entire thing. The purpose of this entire movement has been to take over institutions from the inside and use that power in order to gain rulings and policies that they couldn't win any other way. Trump becomes the vehicle through which they win decades of power. This conservative supermajority on the court that has been built by Leonard Leo and John Roberts and the Federalist Society could last until the 2050s, until the 2060s, depending on the outcome of this next presidential election and actuarial tables and whether the next president gets a couple of picks, whether a U.S. Senate is actually willing to confirm a justice appointed by a Democratic president, which I think is an open question. As far back as 2016, you even had John McCain, who looks pretty moderate compared to the bunch that's there now, saying that there would be no way that a President Clinton would be able to push a Supreme Court justice through a Republican-controlled Senate. So what we have right now is this captured third branch of our government that has effectively become a 9-person super legislature, completely unaccountable to the people, with no ethics standard, no way to review their work, and they continuously have vacuumed up power, whether taking power away from the regulatory state, whether awarding presidents who would use this kind of power effectively immunity. They have remade the Constitution, and they've done so completely outside of the electoral process. This was the entire point, and it's been extraordinarily successful.
We're speaking with Haydenville author David Daley, whose new book out Tuesday is called Antidemocratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. And if you are somebody on the far right, I think everything that David Daley just explained will sound like the victory that in many ways it is. If you are not on the far right, you might want to read this book to see how they did it so well.
But even if you are on the far right, I think there's something we all ought to be able to agree on, which is that no 9 people in a democracy ought to have this kind of fundamental power. They are unelected, they are accountable to no one, and they are remaking and interpreting a constitution that is old and imprecise and vague in the way that they desire to suit their own political means and needs. This ought to be deeply concerning to all of us, no matter whether we agree with the decisions coming down or not.
Let's talk about where the money comes from, because any engine of this sort needs fuel, and political engines all need money. And you talk in depth in how Citizens United really was a large part of that engine driving fuel.
What Leonard Leo, the sort of impresario of the Federalist Society and the architect of this conservative supermajority, has done is to use the Federalist Society, which claims to be just a high-minded conservative debate club, but he has found a way to use it as a transmission belt, a vetting system for judges, because he travels the country, he spends time with all of the law school chapters, all of the illegal chapters around the country. The right gets to know the members and the people in these clubs better than their mother knows them. And as a result, as they move along the career pipeline that the Federalist Society turnstile effectively allows, they have a perfect understanding of who these people are and how they will rule on all of these cases. But the Federalist Society technically is just a debate club if you ask them. But on the other hand, whenever Leo is not doing that, he goes to an office that sometimes is located just down the hall, and he runs this billion-dollar dark money operation that has been funded over the years by the same people who also fund the Federalist Society debate club. They fund this entire octopus of secret dark money groups that help confirm these justices, that help put them on the bench, and then help also generate the kinds of litigation that these judges, once installed on the bench by the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo, will then rule on. The circle is nearly closed. What you have is the same people funding the society that is selecting the judges, who are also funding the research and the legal theories and the law schools, sometimes, that are training these folks, the law review articles that will be dropped into the amicus briefs. They are funding the amicus briefs that the judges will read on the bench, and then they are paying the litigation costs for the cases like Shelby County as they reach the U.S. Supreme Court. The system is completely cooked and rigged by those who are paying for it.
So are all of these decisions the Supreme Court is making that David Daley calls in his book Antidemocratic actually anti-democratic, or are they just decisions David Daley doesn't dig? Coming up, more from Haydenville author David Daley and his book Antidemocratic.
And if all of this has been too much for you, we have some hope. At the end of the show, we'll learn about regenerative agriculture and how it might just save our planet with the Ashfield-based founder of Regenerative Farms International, Mary Johnson.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering Co-op Advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop. NEPM's podcasts are funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com.
We're speaking with Haydenville author David Daley about his new book, Antidemocratic, which is in stores Tuesday, August 6th.
We're all having a drink right here, right now.
I wish.
The Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society are ideas that pop up because the ACLU and Ralph Nader were very effective in using the law and sympathetic judges to have these rulings come about that some people on the left view as positive. They have not been as successful, or some might say nefarious, as some on the right have been doing. My question is, should these things, like civil liberties, like the right to vote, come through the democratic process of voting, or is the Supreme Court's job to rule on what your actual rights are? I remember when equal marriage became the law of the land, the Supreme Court said we shouldn't put this up for a democratic vote. These should be civil rights. This is our job to say that these are your rights as a body. Do you think that is the fundamental rule and responsibility of the court, to be making rulings like that? And maybe they're just making rulings that they feel are rights that other people don't agree with?
Or is that the ruling of a left or center-leaning court? There is some language that gets used in this book that Roberts uses that is honestly a little troubling to me. The idea of race neutral, for one, which I think is very much a double-edged sword. If you're looking at things in terms of neutrality, but interpreting them in a way that, as you mentioned earlier, is a bit dishonest, that becomes a bit problematic.
Yeah. Do we really want to put gay rights up for a vote? Or should an ostensibly neutral body be saying, no, these are human rights and they are yours?
And are they conflating the idea of neutrality with blindness?
I think the question you're really asking is, wait a second, Daley, are you just calling things anti-democratic that you disagree with?
Yeah.
So there, Dave. Gotcha. To which I would say what we have to do is think about what the Supreme Court is and what its role is and what its history has been. What I would argue is that this is not about politics or about decisions that have been handed down, but about a vision of what the court should be versus what the court has actually been. I would say that this is a book that is animated by the idea that the Reconstruction amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments after the Civil War that created black citizenship and voting rights, that became the notion of one person, one vote, that ended slavery, essentially animated the idea of multiracial democracy in a country where it had not previously existed. And that is the truest and the deepest articulation of the notion of equal justice for all under the law. And what the U.S. Supreme Court did, if you go back and look at the history of the court in the 1870s and the 1880s, was it whittled away those amendments in such a way in the Cruikshank case and the Civil Rights Act cases that effectively enabled Jim Crow. We often think that Jim Crow and the end of Reconstruction comes about because of the Hayes-Tilden election, the presidential election of 1876. In reality, it's a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1870s that took away the ability of the federal government to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, returned that power back to state governments that had no intention whatsoever of enforcing that, and effectively unleashed a century of Jim Crow. And that what I would argue is that the conservative originalist plot to control the courts is at its heart just the latest effort to unravel the vision of equality and to promote a tyranny of the minority through profoundly unfair and un-American ways, but ways that are nevertheless deeply at the heart of our history. And that this court right now is not so different from the court that unraveled the dream of multiracial democracy in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. What they are doing on democracy and voting rights is extraordinarily dangerous and is sending us down a path that we have to ask the question, can a multiracial nation become a multiracial democracy? And the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, tried to answer that question in the affirmative. This court, by continuously whittling away at those protections, is saying something different. And to me, this is not a question of do we agree with individual rulings, but what kind of a country do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a country that is animated by the equality spirit of the Reconstruction Amendments, or do we want to live in a country in which 9 people, unelected, completely unaccountable, handpicked by Leonard Leo, make these decisions for us? I would argue very much that that is not the future we want, but I fear it's the future we may have.
This reminds me of one of my friend's terrible games, but it is fascinating to play with other folks who know American history, which is 6 Degrees of the Failure of Reconstruction, where you find a modern problem and you tie it back to the failure of Reconstruction.
It's less fun than the Kevin Bacon game.
Yes, for sure. But
Footloose.
Everybody cut.
It teaches you a lot more. But also, like, a thing that I'm always really fascinated by, especially in this debate where the multiculturalism of elections comes to the fore, is that Black people getting the vote only really happens like about a decade after non-property owners get the vote. So the class struggle with this is very closely tied to the ethnic struggle of this. And I'm curious if you feel that there might also be regression in that regard also.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. When you look at what Shelby County unleashed, and what Shelby County did was it ended preclearance, which had been the most effective enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. It said that the states and municipalities that had the worst history when it came to race and election law had to run any changes that they were going to make past the teacher at the Justice Department before they were allowed to do so. And this worked, and it sort of kept the worst monsters at bay for the nearly 5 decades that preclearance was allowed to exist. The very day that John Roberts removes a preclearance, states across the South were ready because they knew what was coming, because they had watched oral arguments, they had followed what the Federalist Society thinking was on this. They knew that this decision was about to come down. And so on the same afternoon that the court's decision is announced in Shelby County, the state of Texas enacts a voter ID law that they well knew was going to prevent about 600,000 Latinos in the state of Texas from voting because they were citizens. It wasn't as if they didn't have the right to vote. It was that they had intentionally gone through and designed a law that required the kinds of identification, specific forms of identification that they knew those people did not or were most unlikely to have. This is what happens across the South as these voting rights restrictions are put into place in Florida and Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, in states where this had previously not been allowed. They carefully study how to stop the people they were most interested in preventing from getting to the polls and just stack new barriers in front of them time and again. These might be black voters, they might be racial minorities, they might be white voters in certain precincts. What you do, you require certain forms of IDs. Perhaps IDs are okay if you have a gun license, but not okay if you have a student ID. That's a certain kind of person. You move the voting machines from one place to another. You increase the distance between the polls. In the state of Georgia in 2018, if you were voting in largely white precincts, your wait after 6 o'clock was about 2 minutes. If you were voting in a precinct that was not largely white, it was upwards of an hour. This is intentional. And all of this could not be done before 2013. Those changes could not have been made. Once preclearance was removed, once the guards were taken away, the lunatics ran out and reinstalled all of this. The heart of the Shelby County decision is John Roberts saying, things have changed in the South. We don't need this anymore.
It's another Trojan horse.
The very day that this decision comes down, an hour later, he is proven wrong. And 12 years later, the effect of this on all kinds of voters across the South, across the country, is really clear to see.
What's interesting about your book is John Roberts, according to you, uses Massachusetts as an example falsely, that even our Secretary of State in Massachusetts says the data that John Roberts used to argue this from Massachusetts is factually inaccurate, that the ratio of black to white voters, there's more white voters than black voters in Massachusetts, a greater disparity than in any other state. Not true, according to the Secretary of State, and yet is used in the argument. Also interesting to note that Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy is one of the only ones who sees what's coming down the road with John Roberts in his hearing before the Senate, before he's enshrined as the Chief Justice. We could talk about this book all day. Antidemocratic is the book by Haydenville author David Daley, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. This may sound either, like I said, a victory lap book for people who are on the far right, and you'll love every moment of this, or if you are not on the far right, it will be a cautionary tale at the very least and a fascinating historical look.
In either case, I think the information in the book is worth having in your cache.
But you're a huge music fan, David Daley. What did you listen to either on the way here or on the way home to Haydenville to help ease your mind when you're having to go and do all this deep research on all of this stuff?
A lot of REM's Document album. Because if it's the end of the world as we know it, I feel fine.
Do you? It may feel overwhelming at times, but there are ways to help. And one of the ways to help try and save the world is regenerative farming.
There's a documentary about regenerative farming screening at Amherst Cinema tonight. And up next, we'll talk to the Asheville-based founder of Regenerative Farms, Inc., Mary Johnson.
You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
NEPM's podcasts are funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com.
What I'm about to tell you is a matter of life and death. If the soil dies, we die.
The facts have been proven. Roundup does cause cancer.
If you burrow deeply enough, there is a pipeline of money from the pesticide industry into those universities. They're getting the kind of science that money can buy.
Nature is the mother of us all. And if mama ain't happy, we're f***ed.
But there's a way to save our precious soils. It's called regeneration.
Regeneration is not just restoring the land to the state that we found it at, but actually making it better.
We have added over 96 tons of carbon per acre into our soil. Can we mitigate climate change? Absolutely.
Welcome back to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith.
And I'm Monty Belmonte. Tonight at 7 p.m., Amherst Cinema, in partnership with the Hitchcock Center for the Environment in Amherst, they're screening the documentary that you just heard the trailer from, Common Ground. Common Ground is the sequel to the extremely successful documentary Kiss the Ground, which I was able to see. And so were a billion other people globally who were, that documentary inspired the U.S. Department of Agriculture to make a $20 billion investment towards soil health.
By fusing journalistic expose with deeply personal stories from those on the front lines of the food movement, Common Ground unveils a dark web of money, power, and politics behind our broken food system. The film reveals how unjust practices forged our current farm system in which farmers of all colors are literally dying to feed us. The film profiles a hopeful and uplifting movement of farmers who are using alternative, regenerative models of agriculture that could balance the climate, save our health, and stabilize America's economy before it is too late.
The documentary features such celebs as Laura Dern, Rosario Dawson. I had to say, the Twin Peaks David Lynch connection. Love her. Rosario Dawson. I'm not going to fan about all of them. Jason Momoa, Donald Glover, Woody Harrelson, and tonight's Hitchcock Center screening at Amherst Cinema will be followed by a post-screening discussion with a regenerative farmer that I could also fanboy over, Jeremy Barker Plotkin from Simple Gifts Farm. But joining us to talk about the film is Uber Common Ground documentary fan, Amherst's Kate Loving, and the founder of the global organization Regenerative Farms, Inc., from Ashfield, Mary Johnson. So your story, Mary, is incredible about how you, growing up in Ashfield, have made regenerative farming something that is happening all over the globe now. But first, Kate, you reached out to us as a fan of the show and a fan of this documentary, which you've now seen so many times to say, somebody's going to talk about this coming to Amherst Cinema on Monday night. And we tried diligently all last week to get Hitchcock Center involved, but people were on vacation. Tell us why this documentary was so inspiring to you to reach out to us and to get you to come see it again tonight in Amherst.
Actually, some years back, I was online and I saw a video of Gabe Brown speaking about the way that he approaches regenerative agriculture as both a farmer and a rancher. I had never heard of Gabe Brown before. I was totally drawn in, and I was so moved by what he presented that by the end of it, I realized I had been given hope. And for all of the young people in this country, particularly, that look to people of my age, I'm almost 67, and think the older people in this country have just trashed our planet. How could they? I saw a documentary also of the brilliant young woman from Denmark or wherever it was. And she struggled at certain points, despite her brilliancy, in talking to powerful people in the world. She struggled with, why did the older people leave it to us? So my hope, I wish to share that, and this is one way to do it.
The documentary is Common Ground, and it's screening tonight at Amherst Cinema. I mentioned that I watched the prequel to this, which was Kiss the Ground, and it was put on my radar by my father-in-law, who's not really into all of this hippie farming stuff, but he was so inspired by the what goes on in regenerative farming and regenerative agriculture that I saw it, and I was inspired. So Mary Johnson, who has formed the global organization Regenerative Farms, for those who don't know, what is regenerative farming?
Sure, thanks, Monty. So regenerative agriculture really stems in a lot of ways from indigenous agriculture. The root word is regeneration, and for many thousands of years, humans were able to feed themselves and not destroy the planet while they did that. And so many folks who kind of have more recently coined this knowledge into the term regenerative agriculture are really looking at how people used to do that and using science and innovation technology to help enhance how that can work, and using just this marvelous power of nature that can grow a rainforest with no synthetic chemicals or pesticides, tremendous amount of productivity that can feed all kinds of beings, not just humans, and turn that into the farming system that feeds the world of the future while restoring a balance to our climate system.
With your organization in particular, like it's not just the farming aspect of it. There's a reforestation aspect to this too. Can you talk about how important that part is to the farming itself and the agriculture you hope to promote?
Sure, yeah. I laughed a little bit, Monty, when you said this hippie farming stuff, because if you knew Gabe Brown and many of the men and women who have been working hard to figure out how to do this in U.S. agriculture, they're the farthest thing from hippie farmers that you could imagine.
Hippie rancher is not a phrase that gets thrown around very often, but, you know.
Yeah, and it's not seen that often here in the Amherst region, for sure, but in my career, the last 25 years working with folks like Gabe Brown and the other ranchers, they're talking 7,000 acres that they're running with huge machinery. And they're realizing what they're doing is destroying their family, their health, and the planet, and this land that they've had for generations and are caretakers of. And they're reversing what they've been doing at age 65. And they're saying, wow, we've been doing this wrong all these years, and they're figuring out how to do it right. So I just want to presence that mindset when people come to watch this film.
For sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about reforestation too before we get into some of the other things that you brought up?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we're all experiencing here, and lots of the farmers in the valley were coping with last year, was tremendous increase in the rate of weather devastating effects. And so farming that depends on annual crops like corn or rice, they're very vulnerable to these huge disastrous floods and droughts and things that are so common now. So our entire food system all around the world is literally in peril. And the people who are out there every day to toil in the fields and produce this food for all of us, they're seriously struggling. Suicide rates are tremendously high for that reason. Turning to food production from trees is a resiliency strategy. And so that's what my organization was sort of founded to do, to help women who feed the world. Literally, they're the ones out there feeding their children all over the planet, helping them gain all the resources and tools that they need and knowledge that they need to help reverse the degradation on their land and plant these resilient superfood trees that can withstand wind and fire and drought and flood better than these little tiny plants that just fall over at the soonest weather that strikes them.
While feeding them as well, so it's not like taking away part of the crops that they would be using to sustain themselves. Like in addition to creating more stability, like you are also still being fed, which is important.
Right, and it's restoring the planet's sort of lungs of putting back on the earth these trees that have protected humans and stabilized this climate for the thousands and thousands of years that we lived before the last half century.
We're speaking with Ashfield's Mary Johnson, who founded and is the CEO of the global organization Regenerative Farms. You founded it during the pandemic, right? And you just decided now is the time to make this dream a reality?
Yeah, I'll say I'm a little crazy. But it wasn't that moment. It's something that I've been doing as a side sort of passion project for over a decade. And it just turned out that was the right time. Like many other people, I lost my job and I had, kids at home, and I needed to just kind of put my energy during this time of worry and unknown about the future into something that I know has promise and hope, and really try to rally the support that I can for other women who have it far worse all over the world.
How did you encounter regenerative farming? There's so many R's, and I'm from New England, and that just gets hard.
This is something I've been doing professionally for a very long time, and I think it was something I was drawn to. My dad actually was a forester. He taught at Smith Vocational High School when I was growing up, and so I always was planting things and growing things and just kind of had this inner desire to plant things everywhere. And so later on in my career, I worked with organizations here locally with farmers across the state and then internationally.
Mary Johnson from Ashfield, who's a regenerative farmer. There's a documentary about this called Common Ground at Amherst Cinema tonight. I mentioned that your organization is global, Regenerative Farms. How many nations are you in, and what nations are you working with from Ashfield, Massachusetts?
Sure. Yeah, I've worked internationally for a couple of decades now, so I have a large network of community, locally led partners all across the world, from Indonesia to Ghana, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Peru, as well as folks in the United States, in Eastern Kentucky and Hawaii and hopefully more soon. We need more support. So
and
thank
mostly
you.
women that you're working with.
Our goal is to really bring these resources to women.
In the last minute that we have here, one of the goals of your organization is to create regenerative hubs. What is in a hub?
Sure. Yeah. So the hub is really this resource center. So lots of rural women are, facing all kinds of threats to their ability to produce food. And so they can't go far. They don't have transportation. They often don't have education. They need something to come to them that can meet all of their needs in one place. So that's what a hub is. It provides training. It can provide childcare. It can produce locally grown energy, and at the same time bring the crops in, process them, help them sell them. So it's kind of a rural do-it-yourself sort of one-stop shop for value-added processing and beyond.
Wicked cool.
Wicked cool indeed. What an inspiring figure you are, Mary Johnson from Ashfield, who founded this organization that ties into the documentary that got Kate Loving from Amherst so excited to come talk to us about regenerative farming and how we can maybe save ourselves using these methods. There'll be a screening tonight at Amherst Cinema, 7 o'clock, of the documentary Common Ground with our friend Jeremy Barker-Plotkin, another regenerative farmer in the area, doing a Q&A afterwards.
And if you're curious about the organization, check out regenerativefarms.org. There's more info, and you can see pictures and everything. It's great.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow on the Fabulous 413, we're talking with Double Edge Theater Ensemble member Tamantha Sylvester. Double Edge, she is the new voice of C-3PO for the Ojibwe language dub of Star Wars.
And we're going to talk with folks from the African Community Festival about broadening our perspective of the diaspora. And we're going to go get ice cream at Flavors of Cook Farm.
I'm Monty Belmonte.
Ice cream is delicious, and I'm Khalees Smith.
We'll see you tomorrow on the Fabulous 413.
I don't need to fight to prove